He has turned into a really good family friend of mine. My children love him. My cats and dogs love him. If you ever have Christopher Bollyn as a house guest, you will have him back anytime he wants to come. This is a gracious, great guy. And I don't care what all these people are saying about it. Now, I'm going to just tell you right, it's time to be honest and truthful about what's happened here. I want to tell you that my jazz band is canceled because they called and they said they heard this was going to be anti-Jewish. And I told them, I said, this is about facts about 9/11 and the people that were involved in it. And it's also about what the media will not cover. We simply do not have a media anymore in this country. It is owned and controlled. We do not have a free press in this country. And that's why we're living under this condition. And that's why people are scared to say anything.
Yep.
They don't want to do anything. They don't want to say anything. They don't, oh, I don't want to do that. I don't want to say that because I'm going to get in trouble. The news media is going to come on to me and they're going to hurt me and I won't be able to do any business. And it's a fact. They're not acting irrationally. This will happen to you. They'll get on the phone, they'll call you, they'll interrupt your contracts, they'll interfere with your contracts, they'll call your neighbors, they'll call anybody they can, and they'll slam you around. Now, we just can't live in this country anymore like this. Does everybody want to live in a country like this? We want to live here like that? I don't think we do. I don't think. I went to the airport to pick up Christopher Bollyn. I used to go to the airport, and the airport was fun. You got to go out there, you get out the glass, you watch the airplanes come in, you get to watch the people come off. You even see this in movies. You don't do that anymore. You go to the baggage hold. And people come down into the baggage hold. You don't even get to see the airplanes. They don't let you in there. And I asked the guy, I said, where can I go see the planes come in and pick up my friend? Oh, you can't do that. I said, well, why can't I do that? Oh, 9/11, you know, you can't go up there, can't get in there. I'm sick of this, folks. I really am sick of this. I'm up to here in it, man. And I don't care what they call me. They can call me any name they want to, but I'm going to tell you what I am. I am a Jesus freak. I have been born and delivered into the kingdom of heaven by the power of God in Jesus Christ. I'm going to tell you that right now. I don't care. I've been booted out of churches. I've been silenced in churches. I even sued the last pastor I was at. I'm going to tell you, I'm sick of these churches that don't stand up for jack squat. They don't do anything. They don't stand up for Jesus. They don't defend the doctrines of Jesus. I'm going to tell you right now, I'm in the kingdom of heaven. And I don't need no new world order because I already got a king. And his name is Jesus Christ, King of kings and Lord of lords. He sits on a throne in heaven. And if we had a decent church today, they wouldn't permit all this garbage. We'd have newspapers that went out and published the truth and investigated the truth and published them, and they'd all be competing with one another. You know, you've heard about this free competition thing. They got on Microsoft, all this. What about all these newspapers? How come we get the same stupid news on all of these channels? I am totally sick of it, and I am so glad that we had some Budweiser beer in here to help me. So anyway, I'm going to tell you right now, I have never seen anybody that's done any more investigative work in 9/11 in my life. And I've been studying 9/11 since 9/11 happened. And this Christopher Bollyn, he is so far ahead of everybody else. They're having an event in New York. And they got all the stuffed shirts and all the professionals. I'm one of them. I know what all that is. And I know where they're going. But let me tell you, there's phases to this. I don't want to do this like they said the Kennedy assassination. I don't want to be 25 years down the road and we're some kind of weird cult off to the side. I ain't having that. I'm not going to live here like this. I'm not going to have my children go up in this trash anymore. He's done more investigative work than anybody I know. And we need to leave phase one. We know it was an inside job. Everybody knows it was an inside job. Right. What we need to do is move on. Who did it? Now let me tell you, Christopher Bollyn has done more investigation on who did it than anybody I know. And they have beat him up. They come over into his yard and beat him up for it. For snooping around where he shouldn't have been snooping around. Well, that's what journalists do. That's their job, snooping around. Thank God for snooping around. We need to find out what's going on and who's doing it and stop this crap. If we got a foreign army in this country doing stuff to us, black ops, and killing our people and destroying our property, we need to know about that. We need to stop that. We need our churches to stand up and say, we ain't doing that anymore. Because Jesus is the king, and I don't care about no Jews. They didn't say that we're anti-Jewish. I got a call from them and said it was an anti-Jewish thing. This ain't anti-Jewish, it's anti-criminal. And if the criminals turn out to be Jews, so be it. Christopher Bollyn, the best there is.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Ron. Thanks for that introduction. Yeah, 9/11, September 11th, here we are, 15 years later. One of the very most odd things about September 11th, maybe you know, it was a crime in which 3,000 people were killed, but it was not investigated as a crime. It was considered as an act of war because the Pentagon was involved, and the United States then went to war. And it destroyed the evidence, so it wasn't investigated. Now here's this event that happened 15 years ago. 15 years ago, it changed our nation, it changed the relationship of the American people to the government, and it changed the world. And it took us into this war on terror, which we've been deeply engaged in for the past 15 years. But it is not studied. It wasn't investigated, and furthermore, you can't go to University of California or University of Texas and study 9/11 studies to find out what really this is all about and how it changed our history. So this monumental thing happened, monumental crime happened, it wasn't investigated, and it's not being studied. Which is why I call my book Solving 9/11, because it was very evident from the very beginning that this was being covered up, and that the media and the government were in cahoots, and they were going to take us into war. Now, the other thing is that now 15 years later, we have the ability to see where it has taken us. It's taken us into the war on terror, and it has destroyed this country. But more than that, it has brought us into this dysfunctional state in which our government and our military are engaged in a half a dozen wars that we know about. They just put 500 more troops in Iraq. We're in Syria, we're in Afghanistan, we're in Mali, we're in Libya, we're in Somalia, we're in Yemen, and the list goes on and on. They don't talk about it much, but this has changed this country, that we're in a constant state of war, as they promised we would be, and that people don't resist. There's no resistance. It's highly dysfunctional for a nation like this, a democratic republic, to be engaged in wars in which the people have no representation. Our representatives are not part of this. They simply gave to the executive branch the power to wage war. Now I'm going to be very brief because we have a long day ahead of us. This is my last presentation on American tour, and I'm very glad for Ron inviting me down here to be with you, because it's a whole lot more civilized down here than it is in New York City, where I came from. If you don't know, I was in Brooklyn the other night, and there was a small riot in Brooklyn because I was there. Then I was in Manhattan, and that event got pulled too, and I was speaking on the roof, and it rained a little bit that night. But there's good things too. They pull the events everywhere I go. In Massachusetts, and in Connecticut, in New York, and Washington D.C. I was supposed to speak at a little restaurant, a little Iraqi-owned restaurant called Busboys and Poets, and that was all lined up. The D.C. 9/11 Truth had it all lined up. The contract was signed. Again, at the last minute, they pulled that contract. Then there was a little group called the Sarah McClendon Group. It has a permanent establishment at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. And the Sarah McClendon Group, John Hurley, a good old boy from Virginia, got us in there. And we were in the winner's room at the National Press Club instead of some little Iraqi restaurant. And we had a standing room only crowd in Washington, D.C. That was about 5 days ago. So, what I'm talking about, this presentation is more about where we are today and the war on terror. And it's essential to understand that the war on terror was a construct that was already done and ready to go. It was rolled out in 1979 as the way that the future was going to go in the Middle East. The global war on terror. It was rolled out at the Netanyahu Institute at a July conference in 1979 in Jerusalem, where George Herbert Walker Bush was the final speaker. Now, so the essence of this presentation is about how 9/11 was actually the spark that lit the fire that was an already built pyre of wood ready to go. And that's called the global war on terror. So here's our basic problem, our basic situation is that 9/11 was carried out in order to kickstart this war on terror, which is actually a war of aggression, a global war of aggression, terrorism, and conquest. Conquest means going in and stealing the minerals. And 9/11 was designed to trick us into supporting this open-ended criminal agenda. And it's cost us a lot of money, it's cost us trillions of dollars, and millions of people have been killed, and it is our civic duty to resist this deception. Because if we don't, the architects at this highest level will take us into more wars. That's where they're going to go. And that means Iran, possibly Russia, and other countries. And that would be extremely detrimental for our nation and for our children. So, this is me at the Academy Awards a couple of winters ago. My one-man protest. This is Hollywood, California, if you can believe it.
Awesome.
And that's the book. I have a few copies left with me. It's called Solving 9/11, The Deception That Changed the World. And I also have a few copies of the bigger book. It's a set. The bigger book contains my articles that were written in chronological order from September 2001 through April 2012. My background is I was an investigative journalist in Washington, D.C. when it all happened. I was actually passing through New York City early in the morning that day, 2 o'clock. My academic background, I have a degree in history, Middle Eastern history, specialty in Israel and Palestine. And prior to all that, I grew up in a place in Illinois called Schaumburg, and I was an Eagle Scout and recipient of the God and Country Award. And I grew up in the 60s in a country where the principles still mattered. We had principles that we were raised with, and truth was a big part of that. And here I'm speaking in 2004 at the grand jury, citizens grand jury in Los Angeles. So why is 9/11 truth so important? Well, for the same reason why the murder of John F. Kennedy is so important 53 years later. That the murder of Kennedy matters because it was a coup d'etat. And the powers behind the assassination took control of the government and orchestrated the cover-up. And obviously a coup d'etat that's kept secret in the nation means the succeeding government is illegitimate. U.S. military involvement in Vietnam spanned 2 decades. It spiked after Kennedy was killed, of course, because Kennedy wanted to take the troops out of Vietnam. And the Kennedy assassination matters because the U.S. government continues to support the lies of the Warren Commission. And the Kennedy assassination matters because the mainstream media continues to support and even endorse the official version. And the Kennedy assassination matters because when the government supports the lies about the murder of the president, it means that the powers that killed Kennedy are still in charge to this very day. The American people, as Mr. Mars said, have traditionally been of the opinion that there were others involved. So why does 9/11 truth matter? For the same reasons. 9/11 truth matters because the government continues to lie about what happened this very day. And these 2 men being the heads of the government for the last 15 years. And 9/11 was a policy coup that brought us the war on terror and a series of costly wars. The media, of course, says the war on terror will never end. Well, thank you very much. 9/11 truth matters because for 15 years the controlled media has pushed the false narrative about 9/11 and the war on terror, all the while suppressing evidence that exposes the official myth as being a pack of lies. Again, the American people do not believe that the government's been truthful. And they did a series of polls from 2002 to 2006, and when they discovered in 2006 that only 16% of the population thought the government was telling the truth, they stopped polling. So here's our predicament in a nutshell. If the government and media are lying to us about 9/11, it means they are controlled by the same people who carried out 9/11. And I think you can see that's a very serious state of affairs. Why do they cover up? They cover up to protect the culprits from being identified, the actual people who carried out the crime, to prevent the official myth from being exposed as a pack of lies, which it is, and to advance the fraudulent war on terror, the Zionist war agenda that is being waged by the United States, which was the primary reason for 9/11 in the first place. So 9/11 was a highly sophisticated false flag terror atrocity that was designed to create shock and awe, and to fear and rage in the population, to compel us to support the war agenda, the global war agenda known as the global war on terror. And starting a war, again, reiterating, starting the war on terror was the primary reason for the false flag terror of 9/11. Obviously, it's based on the myth, the war on terror is based on the myth of 9/11. They go hand in hand. That's why I call it a dual deception. This is one of these German photographers, German journalists who happened to be present at both recent terror attacks in Nice, France, and Munich, Germany. His name is Richard Gutjahr. What's interesting, he's also married to a very high-level Israeli intelligence agent. That's Richard Gutjahr on top, that's his wife down below. And she's a lieutenant in Unit 8200, which is Israeli signal intelligence. So not only is it uncanny that he happened to be at both terror attacks about a month ago, he filmed them both, he put them online as they happened, and then he's got this interesting connection to the Israeli intelligence. What a coincidence, right? The Zionist connection. Here we have Israeli Chief of Staff Shaul Mofaz. Now, Shaul Mofaz is an Iranian Jew. He was the head of Israeli military on 9/11. And 3 months later, here he is talking with what they call the Defense Policy Board. These are the three main Zionist neocons who make the policy that the United States Pentagon puts into effect. So it's Wolfowitz to his left, Rabbi Dov Zakheim across the table with glasses, and the man to his right is Douglas Feith. And what were they talking about? What were they planning besides, now the comptroller of the Pentagon is the man sitting across who's smiling with the glasses. He's the man who was in charge of counting the beans at the Pentagon when $2.3 trillion went missing. And that's what Mr. Rumsfeld had reported the day before 9/11. That's a lot of money, 2.3 trillion with a T. Okay, we went to war in Afghanistan shortly after, of course, in October 2001. And the war in Afghanistan is currently costing American taxpayers $4 million per hour of every day that this war goes on. So a sum total of $738 billion since 9/11. And here's Camp Bucca. This is an American concentration camp in Iraq, and this is the place where ISIS was created. This is where the leadership of ISIS all spent long periods of incarceration. So what was the plan? What was the war plan after 9/11? Well, General Wesley Clark spelled it out in 2007. He said about 10 days after 9/11, I went to the Pentagon and saw Rumsfeld and Wolfowitz. And one of the generals called me and said, "Sir, we've made the decision we're going to war with Iraq." "We're going to war with Iraq," he said. "Why?" "I don't know," he said. I came back a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" He said, "Sir, it's much worse than that. We're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq, then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran." And as you can see, 5 of those 7 countries have already been done. So this prognosis is pretty clear. It was correct. What's going on here? Well, it's an Israeli plan called the Yinon plan. And a man named Oded Yinon from the Likud, he's a military strategist. He presented this plan in Hebrew in an Israeli magazine called Kibunim, a journal for Judaism and Zionism. And thanks to a guy named Israel Shahak, a professor of chemistry at Hebrew University, he translated this document into English, and a group called Arab American University Graduates published it. And what it represents is it's Israel's plan to dominate the Middle East by basically doing something called balkanization. Balkanization is what was done in Yugoslavia. You take the big countries that are your enemies and you break them up along their ethnic and religious fracture lines. So that in the case of Iraq, for example, Iraq is today de facto a three-state state. It's ethnic statements of Shiites in the south, Sunnis in the west, which is now ISIS, and in the north, Kurdistan. Now, Syria is in the process of being broken up. Libya is broken up. Sudan has been broken up officially. So this is what's going on. And when Israel does this, Israel will be just one ethnic state in a sea of ethnic states. There's the ethnic constituent parts. So, I can't go back to that easy. But it shows that the Shiites are in the south, the Sunnis are in the west, the Kurds in the north, and these, the Middle East is a patchwork quilt of ethnicities. This is a drawing by David Deese. In 1948, just before Israel became a state, the year that this whole thing broke out in the Middle East, 47-48, after the partition plan of Palestine, the Joint Chiefs of Staff published 13 papers on what Zionism would mean to the United States military. And the final paper they wrote was called Force Requirements for Palestine in 1948, before Israel became a state. And this is the very important quote. They said, Zionist strategy, Zionist means the state of Israel basically, Jewish nationalism. He said, Zionist strategy will seek to involve the United States in a continuously widening and deepening series of operations intended to secure maximum Jewish objectives. And they identified in the paper what these Jewish objectives were. The key ones here are the expansion of Eretz Israel into Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. And secondly, the establishment of Jewish military and economic hegemony over the entire Middle East. This is where we are today. This is exactly what's going on today. And as you can see, this drawing by Mr. Deese, he shows Libya, Iraq, and Afghanistan already, roadkill on the side of the road, and Syria is now in the sights. This is Hillary Clinton, and there was a leaked email a few weeks ago from 2012, where Hillary Clinton wrote about the strategy for Syria. She said, the best way to help Israel is to use force to overthrow the government of Syria. So that clearly shows that the United States policy to overthrow the government of Syria is not in America's best interest. There's no national interest of ours there, but it's part of the Israelis' national interest. And here's our current Secretary of State, Mr. Kerry, and listen to this, what he said in May of this year. When you listen to this man talking, he's not looking for peace. He's not a negotiator. He's a general calling the shots. He says if Assad's strategy is to somehow think he's going to just carve out Aleppo, the biggest city in the country, by the way, and carve out a section of the country, I got news for you and for him. This war doesn't end. Because as long as Assad is there, the opposition is not going to stop fighting him one way or the other. Well, he should know, he's the one who's financing the opposition. We're paying $1 billion a year, the CIA, to fund these militia groups who are fighting the elected government of Syria. And it was elected in June 2014 in a multi-party election. So we're overthrowing a democratic regime. Here's a poor little boy, and there you see at the bottom it says that in 2011, Obama put CIA in charge of operations in Syria, spending about $1 billion annually to arm anti-government forces in Syria. Who are we fighting now? Now we're fighting ISIS, and this is the latest iteration of the Al-Qaeda threat. Al-Qaeda became ISIS in Iraq, and that's who we're fighting now, this ragtag group. One important thing is why these guys are always wearing black masks. You know why? Because 25,000 of them are mercenaries. Highly paid mercenaries from all corners of the world, and they have to hide their identity because they intend to have a career after this is all over if they survive. Now this is very interesting. Here's John McCain from Arizona, Senator McCain. He made an illegal entry visit into Syria to meet the heads of these rebels that we're funding and arming. And the guy lurking in the background behind John McCain's right shoulder there is the head of ISIS. His name is Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. There's a picture of him from CBS News when he was in Camp Bucca for 5 years, working with the Americans very closely. There he is currently, and here he is, the wanted poster in the corner. When John McCain was talking to him, there was a $10 million bounty on his head from the State Department. And there he is in the bottom corner on the right. There he is speaking in Iraq as the caliph, the new caliph of the Islamic State. It's all show. It's all show. And here's American troops in Syria, May 25th of this year. We have lots of American troops fighting in Syria. They don't talk about it, and of course when they come back to this country, they're not allowed to talk about it. So ever since 9/11 happened, we've engaged in this war on terror, and the war on terror has resulted in a 4,500% increase in terrorism. So people are 10 times more likely to be killed, or 10 times as many people are being killed now due to terrorism than they were before 9/11. And most of the people are being killed in the countries where we're fighting the war on terror, namely Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan. We're spending a huge amount of money. We're spending $400 million per year for U.S. victim of terrorism. So as a leading cause of death, it's getting the lion's share of the money. But it's not a leading cause of death. The leading causes of death are the ones that are not being funded, like heart disease, influenza, and cancer. That stack would be up to 1,000 times taller. So we're dealing with something called criminal fraud. This is not any sort of wise use of resources. And by the way, of course, all the money that's being spent is borrowed money, increasing our enslavement to the banksters. So here's the mastermind of the war on terror, Mr. Netanyahu. And the quote down below is from Dr. Alan Sabrowski, formerly with the U.S. Army War College. And And he wrote this in 2009. He said, the evidential trail for 9/11 and the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq runs from PNAC, AIPAC, and their cohorts through the mostly Jewish neocons in the Bush administration, who you saw earlier, and back to the Israeli government. None of the denials and political machinations can alter that essential reality. That's Netanyahu on the right. The other guy is a guy named Ehud Olmert, another Israeli prime minister from the Likud party. What's interesting about him, he was the deputy prime minister of Israel on 9/11, and he was in New York City on September 10th and September 11th, 2001. But his presence in New York City was kept secret, which is very odd because he was also the mayor of Jerusalem. And Jerusalem is the sister city of New York City, so when such a person, a high-level Israeli, comes to visit New York, it's usually front-page news. But in this case, it was completely kept out of the news. Why? 10 days later, he came back and held Giuliani's hand, acted like the big brother in terrorism, which he is. But why was his visit to New York City kept secret? I discovered it by reading the Jerusalem Post sports page. Years later, it was reported that he was there and he had made a deal in New York City on September 10th, 2001. So this man appeared. This is Israel's highest chief of staff, former defense minister and prime minister. His name is Ehud Barak. And before either tower fell on September 11th, he was in the London studio of the BBC World, which happens to be the largest English broadcasting network in the world. And he said, "The world will never be the same from today on," he said. "We know who's behind this. It's Osama bin Laden. And we know where Osama bin Laden is." He said, "Now it's time to launch an operational, concrete war against terror." Amazing. And his little analysis, very briefly stated, became, of course, the official line, and has been ever since. What's the relationship? Well, Ehud Barak was Netanyahu's commander in the Israeli covert commando force known as the Sayeret Matkal. It serves directly under Israeli military intelligence and chief of staff. That's why they call it independent. It has freedom of movement. Here's the New York Times on September 12th. But the 9/11 crime was much more complicated than the New York Times lets you think. And the quote over there on the far side is what Larry Johnson, he was the deputy director of counterterrorism at the State Department. He said, looking at the complexity and the sophistication of the 9/11 crime, he said, "We don't have anything in history to compare with this. The only thing that comes close to it is a former Soviet intelligence operation." And he's right. It's like a Russian doll. It's a crime within a crime within a crime. And the deception is equally complicated. And some people will say, "Oh, Mr. Bollyn, you're being unfair to Israel. Israel would never attack the United States." Au contraire. On June 8, 1967, they attacked the USS Liberty in a murderous assault on an American spy vessel in international waters off the coast of Egypt. In one fell swoop, they killed 34 Americans. And we now know from the transcripts from the pilots were asked by Israeli ground control in Tel Aviv, "Identify the target, please, identify." They say, "It's American, it's American." The command came back, "Sink it, no survivors." So here's 9/11. This is some quotations from Vincent Salandria about the Kennedy murder, but the quotes are very appropriate also for 9/11. He said, "All the time it was obvious, it was blatantly obvious that it was a conspiracy." Amen. And then he goes on to say, "The cover story was transparent and designed not to hold, to fall apart at the slightest scrutiny." And it's the same with Kennedy murder as it is with 9/11. It's painfully obvious that we're dealing with a pack of lies. This is the pulverization of the Twin Towers. The war on terror has cost us $1.7 trillion with a T, and that's just for the war fighting. When you factor in the cost of veterans' health, all of the incurring costs that result, it's over $4 trillion. All borrowed money again. But wait a minute, what is the war on terror? And where did the war on terror come from? When did Americans start acting like deep Soviet Union back in Stalin's time and having gulag archipelagos in the Caribbean and treating people like this? When did we become this kind of nation? And where did it come from? Well, the war on terror is actually an Israeli stratagem pushed by Netanyahu since 1979 to bring the US military into the Middle East to wage war on behalf of the Zionist state, which is another word for Israel. Here's Netanyahu. He came out with these books in the 1980s. Terrorism, How the West Can Win, and Fighting Terrorism. And he uses the word terrorist to basically delegitimize Palestinian resistance to Israeli occupation. This is the wall that was built across Palestine in the West Bank and Gaza and around Jerusalem and Bethlehem. If you go to Bethlehem today, you come across this wall. You have to go through this wall to get to Bethlehem. And it's twice as high as the Berlin Wall and 40 times longer, and it was built after 9/11. This is what the Likud party wanted. There's the Palestinian terrorists. So 22 years after it was born at the Jerusalem Conference in 1979, the war on terror became operational with the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan. Again, the ultimate purpose of 9/11 was to start the war on terror. On the day that it happened, New York Times interviewed Mr. Bibi Netanyahu, and on that day, it was estimated that 20 to 30,000 people were killed on 9/11. That's what they thought. And they asked Mr. Netanyahu, how will this affect Israeli-American relations? And he said, it's very good. He said, well, it's not very good, but it'll generate immediate sympathy. Now, who in their right mind would say it's very good when you're talking about 20, 30,000 people dead, except somebody who saw some benefit to the crime, from the crime? And he did. Later he spoke in Hebrew at Bar-Ilan University in Israel, and he said, we are benefiting from one thing. He means the Israelis. We're benefiting from one thing, and that is the attack on the Twin Towers and Pentagon and the American struggle in Iraq. Well, clearly that's three things there, but he sees them as one. He's the chairman of the Likud party since 1993. And what's interesting here, again, from the Israeli press, for years, Netanyahu and Silverstein kept in close touch. Every Sunday afternoon, like this time, Netanyahu would call Silverstein. It made no difference where Netanyahu was, he would always call. Their ties continued after Netanyahu became prime minister in 1996. How did Mr. Larry Silverstein get possession of these big, giant, publicly owned towers? Well, it went this way. Ronald Lauder, this man here, the son of Estee Lauder, was put in charge of the privatization scheme of Governor Pataki. He then decided what they would privatize. So they decided to privatize the World Trade Center. Then it went to Lou Eisenberg, who was the executive director of the Port Authority, who oversaw the negotiations that delivered the Twin Towers to Larry Silverstein. Now, Silverstein and Eisenberg are both board members of something called the UJA Federation of New York. So they have this back-channel Zionist connection, which obviously trumped in the deal here. Because as Mr. Mars said, Larry Silverstein did not really have the wherewithal to put down the money. He borrowed $100 million from GMAC. So here it is, when he got the World Trade, he got the keys to the front door, July 24th. He said, I'm proud, Larry Silverstein said, I'm proud to assume the stewardship of the World Trade Center, one of New York's greatest jewels. 5 weeks later, this is what was left of those jewels. Only at ground zero, there was a lot of steel, and the dust, that's all that was left. Dust and steel. And the dust went all over lower Manhattan and into the ocean and into the river, and Brooklyn. So we're talking about the war on terror. How did it develop? Where did it come from? Well, as I said, it's an Israeli stratagem, so let's look at the history. This is one of the founders of this idea. He's the head of his name is Menachem Begin. He came from Russia. He came to Palestine in '42. He became the head of the Irgun. The Irgun was part of the Beitar, the New Zionist organization. It's kind of radical, right-wing. And then he ordered the bombing of the King David Hotel in 1946. Now, the bombing of the King David Hotel in '46 is very similar to 9/11. It was the destruction of evidence. It was one of the key motivations there. He became prime minister. He became prime minister in 1977 and invaded Lebanon promptly the next year. This is the emblem of his group, the Irgun, and you can see that there's a map of Israel that's larger than the state today. That's called Eretz Israel. It means the land of Israel, and it's the biblical notion that Israel should expand to its greatest territory that they ever saw or could, find in the Bible. And Netanyahu's father was the head of this organization when Mr. Jabotinsky died in New York City in 1940. So you see, the Netanyahu family is very closely engaged in this new Zionist order. This is the idea. This comes from an Israeli website. The article is called "What Israel's Future Borders Will Look Like," from the Euphrates to the Nile, basically, and everything in between. And this comes from this is not new development. Even here, this is David Ben-Gurion is speaking to his general staff in May of 1948, basically 1 week after Israel became a state. And he talks about, preparing to go on the offensive. He says, we should prepare to go on the offensive with the aim of smashing Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, and creating a Christian state in the south of Lebanon, and then smashing Syria and Egypt. So there was this aggressive policy that was being, discussed at the highest levels of the Israeli military from the very beginning. And here's Mr. Begin in 1948. This is the bombing of the King David Hotel in 1946. This is Shimon Peres. He was recently the president of Israel, and he was involved in something called the Lavon Affair, which is not taught in schools in this country. The Lavon Affair was another Israeli false flag operation where they tried to bomb British and American libraries and cultural institutions in Egypt to be blamed on NASA. It was in 1954, and one of the nitroglycerin bombs went off in somebody's pocket. They busted the whole thing. They found the Mossad was deeply involved in it. And the Prime Minister of Israel at the time, Moshe Sharett, he was a moderate. And when he learned that these guys were going off and doing these things on their own, he got very ticked off. And he said that he realized that the terrorists were taking over Israeli government. He realized that the moderates were losing out in social Darwinism, and the bad guys, the more ruthless ones, the ones who use terrorism, were winning. And he said that Shimon Peres shares the same ideology as Mr. Lavon. He said he wants to frighten the West into supporting Israel's aims. And that's exactly what's going on today with all this terrorism, 9/11, everything. Terrorism is meant to make us afraid, to stop thinking, and to increase our fear, our visceral fear. So we will support then anything that will reduce that fear. And if that means going to war with Iran, so be it. So that we are basically a nation that is now enslaved to the deception. A people who are deceived are not a free people. When you're deceived, you are enslaved to the deception. Menachem Begin claimed to be the father of terrorism. He was asked in 1974, how does it feel in the light of all that's going on to be the father of terrorism in the Middle East? He said, in the Middle East, he said, in all the world. And as you see here, his party that he started, the Irgun party, the Likud, is now in the hands of that man who's smiling down below, Mr. Netanyahu. Here's when Begin came to power in '77. This is when he tried to conquer this southern part of Lebanon, and they stayed there from 1978 until 2002, when they were kicked out by Hezbollah. Hezbollah is not a terrorist group. Hezbollah is a resistance group. And here you have these leaders of the Likud party in the 1980s. Begin in the middle, Yitzhak Shamir on the right, and on the left, the big guy, Ariel Sharon. This is when this man, Yitzhak Shamir, was in the days before the State of Israel, he ran a gang called the Stern Gang, or Lehi. And the Stern Gang was involved in bank robberies and murder and whatnot. And they killed the United Nations mediator who was sent there to try to make a solution to the war that had developed after they partitioned Palestine. And they killed that man in the New York Times there. That's the United Nations mediator named Folke Bernadotte. He's from Sweden. He's from the royal family of Sweden. And they killed him Bonnie and Clyde style because he basically said that there will be no peace here if we don't let the Palestinians go back to their homes. And because that was anathema to the Zionist movement, this radical group called Stern Gang killed him under the leadership of Yitzhak Shamir. Now there was another man in that group who came to America in the early 50s. That's his father. This is Rahm Emanuel, currently mayor of Chicago, special advisor, special senior advisor to Bill Clinton for 8 years, chief of staff, first person appointed by Barack Obama. He's the Mossad man in the White House, and there's no term limits on them. His daddy, Benjamin Emanuel, formerly Benjamin Auerbach, was a leading guy in the Stern Gang when they killed Folke Bernadotte. And I spoke to his father. I spoke to Benjamin, so he told me himself that he was a member of that gang. So now I'm going to talk about something called ideation, Israeli ideation. Ideation is the idea the concept where you put an idea out there. You put an idea in the films or in the music or the videos. And in 1978, this high-level Israeli agent named Arnon Milchan, film producer, made his first movie in which the climactic scene was a Boeing 747 going into the Pan Am building. Ah, prescience. What did this guy know? Well, he knew a lot. Here he is, in the same year he made the film, he's speaking with the Israeli Defense Minister Ezra Weizman in 1978. There he is making the movie there, getting all the props in order. Then in 2000, he made another movie in which a Boeing aircraft flies right into the World Trade Center. And that was a TV show called The Lone Gunman, which he made together with his business partner, Rupert Murdoch. Here he is between his two buddies, Shimon Peres and Bibi Netanyahu. He's worth a lot of money. He's a big money launderer. Here's Mr. Netanyahu with his dad about the late 1970s. Now, Netanyahu had worked in Boston with the Boston Consulting Group, a Rothschild-owned firm, for 2 years, and then in 1979 he went back to Israel and started something called, the Netanyahu Institute. And the first thing they did is they had a conference in Jerusalem called the Jerusalem Conference on International Terrorism. And as I said, that's when they rolled the war on terror out on the global stage. And it began a big propaganda push. And the third day of the final day of the conference, George Herbert Walker Bush was the main speaker. In 1980, an evangelist from Texas named Michael Evans, he has something called the Jerusalem Prayer Team. He went over and he was very close with Mr. Menachem Begin and these Likudniks. And he talked to this, the chief of the Mossad, the first chief of the Mossad, the first chief of Shin Bet, the former intelligence chief of Haganah. The man's name is Isser Harel. And he asked Mr. Harel, do you think terrorism will come to the United States, to America? And if so, where and why? And Harel said, yes, I fear it will come to you in America. America has the power but not the will to fight terrorism. La la la. As to the where, Harel continued, New York City is a symbol of freedom and capitalism. It's likely they will strike the Empire State Building, your tallest building, and a symbol of your power. So this is the prediction that this Israeli intelligence chief was making in 1980 about what Arabs would do 21 years later. But right away after he made this prediction, oh, I have to go back. Well, those two men there, let me see if I can do this. Previous. There we go. He sent these two of Isser Harel's big agents, went over there to, as grown men, went to the United States. Now those guys, the top guy is Zvi Malkin, and the bottom guy is Avraham Shalom Ben-Dor. And these two men had been working with Mossad and with Isser Harel for a long, long time. They'd been involved in, for example, the kidnapping of Eichmann in Argentina in 1960 or 61, and they'd been involved in smuggling plutonium from this country to Israel for the nuclear bombs program. So these guys were not small fry, they were big. They went to New York City with the task of getting the security contract for the World Trade Center. And they actually got it. In 1987, they got the security contract. But when the Port Authority discovered that the man with the suspenders, Avraham Shalom Ben-Dor, was using a false name, and that he had been convicted of murder back in Israel, they tore up the contract. Had they not torn up the contract in 1987, 9/11 probably would have happened in the late 80s or 1990s. But, as it were, they didn't quit, they didn't give up, they didn't go back to Israel and say, oh, we can't do this, forget it, takes all dough. No, they went to work for these guys, Jules Kroll and Maurice Greenberg. The man at the top is Jules Kroll. These two are business partners. Maurice Greenberg, you probably remember, is the CEO of the criminal insurance company called AIG that received $180 billion in bailout 2008-2009. Well, they had a company together called Kroll Associates. And Kroll Associates, in 1993, when the bomb went off in the basement of the World Trade Center, Kroll Associates got the security contract for the World Trade Center, and they began coming up with new procedures. Now, what had happened is that Avraham Shalom Ben-Dor, the Israeli guy, when they had been thwarted by the Port Authority, that he went to work for Kroll Associates. So using the American Jew like a Trojan horse, they got in to the operation all the same. Okay, here's Ariel Sharon rolling into Lebanon in 1982. This was an invasion that was meant to occupy South Lebanon. And, of course, the Israelis could not hold South Lebanon, so they invaded as far as they wanted to go. Then they asked America to come hold the line. Remember, peacekeepers, right? So Ronald Reagan sent over more than a couple hundred, about 300, 400 peacekeepers, but there was no peace to be kept. Israel had occupied South Lebanon, and now they asked for French and American and Italian troops to hold the line. Well, that turned out to be a big disaster. There was a car bomb that blew up and killed 241 Americans in Beirut. One detail about that, if you read the book by Victor Ostrowski, the Canadian guy who was a Mossad agent, he writes about how the Mossad knew all about that truck bomb. They knew where it was being made, how it was being made, license plate number, the color of the car, everything. But they didn't tell the Americans anything. They told the Americans the skimpiest. The Mossad chief Aharoni said, America's a big power. They can take care of themselves. So they let it happen. So when the Israelis had created this construct, I call it a construct of the war on terror, you've got this idea going there, you got a doctrine, but you got to have an enemy. You can't have a war unless you have an enemy. So they had to create an enemy. And that opportunity became very good when the Russians invaded Afghanistan in 1979. So the Afghan resistance movement became a perfect place to cultivate Al-Qaeda. And what happened is in 1983, Ronald Reagan began supplying the CIA with money and the go-ahead to arm these guys called the Mujahideen, because they were waging jihad against the Red Army that had occupied their country. Oh, I went the wrong way. And the guy that was running that was a Texan named Charlie Wilson, I think from East Texas. And he was a very pro-Israel guy. He was a real, Christian Zionist type fellow. He thought Israel was a wonderful thing. Oh, why should I be doing that? And he started working to get funding for the Mujahideen. But what most peculiar about this is that they were given the lion's share of the funding to the most anti-Western group, headed by a guy named Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. So what happened is that the CIA and Saudi Arabia began funding the operation, and Israel was the one who provided the weapons and the training for this group in Pakistan. But why would the CIA and Israeli military intelligence, why would they choose to train and arm the most virulently anti-Western group out there? It makes no sense unless you consider that they were actually creating the enemy for the next war. Here's the relationship. When Charlie Wilson went to Washington, he came under the spell of this head of Israeli Mossad named Zvi Rafia. And you may have seen the movie. There's a movie called Charlie Wilson's War, but the book is where you want to get the information. In the book, they reveal that the Mossad chief, Mr. Rafia, treated Charlie Wilson's congressional office as if it were his own. And here's the quote down below. He says, Rafia always acted as if he owned Wilson's office. One of the staffers kept a list of people he needed to lobby. He would use the phones, give projects to the staff, and call on Charlie to intervene whenever he needed him. How peculiar, what a relationship. And whenever Charlie Wilson went to Israel, which was pretty often, Zvi Rafia took care of his whole schedule, who he talked to, what he met. So these two guys crafted this idea that they would arm this anti-Western group. But you have to say, who's the alpha dog in this relationship? Who has the intelligence? Who has the strategic planning? And who's doing the bidding of the other? And what they did then is they started arming these guys who were Arabs who had come to help the Hekmatyar faction. So they recruited Arabs from different Arabic countries. And of course, the most famous one was this guy named Osama bin Laden. And Osama bin Laden joined into that group in 1984. This is exactly when the Israelis began the training of the group that became Al-Qaeda. And the guy who ran military intelligence at that time, our good friend Ehud Barak. He was head of military intelligence from 83 to 85. And so what happened is the Israelis, if you've lived in Israel, you know that there's a lot of Israelis that come from Middle Eastern countries where they speak the language, they speak Persian or they speak Arabic. They come from Yemen and Morocco and Iraq. So it's very easy to cultivate, Israeli agents who speak fluent Arabic, which is what they were doing here. So these guys were training. They trained Osama bin Laden in the early 80s. Here he is, saying goodbye to Ariel Sharon, and Ariel Sharon was found responsible for the massacre in Sabra and Shatila, the massacre of some several thousand Palestinians in those camps. Here's the first guy. This is the first Israeli agent who trained Osama bin Laden. His name's Ali Mohammed. He's a Hebrew-speaking double agent. Apparently he was born in Egypt. He was trained a great deal in this country, in Fort Bragg and down in Arizona, at American Military Intelligence. And he went over there and he taught the Osama bin Laden and the other Al-Qaeda people everything they knew, how to create cells. And then he created the cell in Nairobi. This guy went to Nairobi and created the cell, which blew up the American embassies. For that, he was held guilty in this country in a court of law, federal court, and sentenced to life imprisonment in a U.S. federal penitentiary, from which he promptly vaporized and disappeared without a trace. Now, how do you disappear from a federal penitentiary without a trace? You must have some friends in high places. And he created this guy, he trained these guys. And when these guys fell out of favor, when Saudi Arabia got tired of this group, and Pakistan ditched them, they became Al-Qaeda and Taliban. They merged. This is the group that was created by Israeli military intelligence and infiltrated by Israeli military intelligence, and they became Al-Qaeda. Here's catastrophic terrorism. This is Foreign Affairs magazine, and this is just showing you how Philip Zelikow and Ashton Carter, how they created this mindset in public opinion, but most importantly in the opinion of intelligentsia, people who read this magazine, that catastrophic terrorism was going to befall the United States of America. And when it does, this is what you should do. And as you can see here, the first subtitle, they were imagining the transforming event. Now, the man who wrote this, Philip Zelikow, he was the head of a group called the Catastrophic Terrorism Study Group. And this is his report from his group. He then went on to write the myth of what happened on 9/11. And here's Ashton Carter, top left, and the man with the blue sweater in the back is John Deutsch, the two co-authors of this report. At the time that they wrote the report, they were senior partners of a group called Global Technology Partners, which is an exclusive affiliate of Rothschild North America. Now, if you look at Ashton Carter, if you look at his resume, his CV, you will see that his entire life has been spent working for the Rothschilds. And he's now Secretary of Defense. Here's another group that was imagining this transformation. It's called the PNAC Group. PNAC Group was a family-run operation by the Kagan family, or the Kagan family. Down there at the bottom, Don Kagan, his two sons, Robert and Fred. Robert's wife is the Assistant Secretary of State for Eurasia. Her name is Victoria Nuland Kagan. And she's the woman who almost single-handedly made the coup d'etat in Kiev, which brought this country very close to war with Russia. And we are still in that very serious situation. If you listen to people like Fox News, you'll see that the controlled media in this country, the Zionist media in this country, is pushing very hard against Russia, dangerously so, inciting people to hate Russia, to hate these countries like Iran, to hate Islam. It's warmongering. Oh, this group said that, you know, they imagined transformation. The PNAC group called for the United States to invade Iraq and occupy Iraq permanently. And they said that we should do this regardless of whether Saddam Hussein is on the throne or not. And they said this transformation would likely take a very long time, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor. The new Pearl Harbor was 9/11. And let's see if I can move back to that one. Yeah, Pearl Harbor, the new Pearl Harbor was, of course, the attacks of September 11th. And these attacks, as I said, were meant to be a spectacle. They were meant to create shock and awe. They were meant to get this country hit in the gut, so that we would react as we did and support open-handed war in the Middle East. And of course, I said he came out, this Israeli chief of staff came out and said, it's time to launch an operational concrete war against terror. And that's where we've been for the last 15 years. George Bush said the same thing, that our way of life and our very freedom was under attack. And he bifurcated the world. He said, America was targeted for attack because we are the brightest beacon of freedom and opportunity in the world. And he said, on September 20th, 2001, he declared war on terror, saying every nation and every region now has a decision to make. Either you're with us or you're with the terrorists. They made it extremely simple for the world to understand that the world was now being split between those who were with us and those who were terrorists. And here is the latest phase on the war on terror is Islamic State. Now there's something very peculiar about this, is that everything we know about this group comes to us from Israeli intelligence. It comes via this lady here, her name is Rita Katz. She's in Bethesda, Maryland. She has a little group called SITE. And what she does is she releases the videos to the media before the bad guys even release the videos. In CNN, this is when the American beheading video came out. She admitted on CNN, she said, in fact, within a short time after our release, ISIS account on social media indicated that within a short time, they would be releasing the video, only we actually had the video beforehand. And we're able to beat them with the video, with the release. Now, how does her little group in Maryland, how do they have a copy of the video before the bad guys have even released it? It's not possible unless they have the same author. And ISIS is, by the way, also the actual acronym for Israeli intelligence. It stands for Israeli Secret Intelligence Service. And SITE stands for Search for International Terrorist Entities. And this is a group that basically informs U.S. military and U.S. intelligence about the bad guys in the Middle East, so we know who to go fight. Like this guy, they said, this is the guy they killed the other day, and they say, he said, we will strike you in your homeland, Adnani said, calling on Muslims to kill Europeans. especially the spiteful and filthy French. Smash his head with a rock or slaughter him with a knife or run him over with your car. He said it, according to site intelligence. So they're creating the enemy for you. They're explaining, showing. Here they're showing us the guy who did 9/11, except this guy is certainly not Osama bin Laden. It's a fraudulent video. Knows everything about him is wrong. He's not the right guy. That guy is Osama bin Laden. So whenever something terrible happens in terrorist relations, in terrorist events, then the Israeli chief will comment on them. And here this is Netanyahu, Prime Minister of Israel. After the shooting in Orlando, he came out and interpreted the Orlando shooting for us. He said, this week's shooting wasn't merely an attack on the LGBT community. It was an attack on all of us, on our common values of freedom and diversity and choice. He said, radical Islamist terror makes no distinction between shades of infidel. This week it was gays in Orlando. A few days before it was Jews in Tel Aviv. All of us are targets, and working together we will defeat them even faster. And then he says, okay, so let's go guys, you first. As you'll see, the Israelis are never involved in waging fighting any of these wars. They're simply telling us where to go. That's the cost, 1.7 trillion just in war fighting costs alone. So the 9/11 cover-up is an essential part of the deception that has enabled the culprits to dupe the American public into supporting the global war on terror, the real aim of the 9/11 terror atrocity. And as Richard Nixon said, it's not the crime that gets you, it's the cover-up. And he should know, because in the cover-up, you're exposed. So the three crucial elements of a false flag cover-up: you have to control the investigation, you have to control the interpretation, that's how the media explains it to the public, and then you have to control the litigation, the court process, in order to prevent any legal discovery from coming out in a court of law. First part is the controlled investigation, or as I said, the non-investigation, because there was no criminal investigation. We're not asking for a new investigation, we're asking for a criminal investigation in the first place. And the people who should have investigated 9/11 are these two characters: Attorney General John Ashcroft and his sidekick, Assistant Attorney Michael Chertoff, Assistant Attorney General Chertoff, who was in charge of the criminal division of the DOJ on that day. And he was given the portfolio to prosecute and investigate 9/11. That means, of course, that the sub-agency of the Department of Justice is FBI. So the FBI was charged with doing the investigation. But what was the FBI doing? They were busy confiscating evidence and destroying it. They were confiscating the evidence, which we've never seen. We've never gotten those videotapes from the Pentagon. We've never seen those engine parts again. It was all destroyed, 24/7. And that man, he was in charge of the investigation. It didn't happen. Then they made him Homeland Security Czar. And in his position as Homeland Security Czar, he maintained his control over the investigation and access to the evidence for another 5 years or so. So for like the first decade, this one Israeli man here, Michael Chertoff, prevented any investigation from into 9/11. And since there was no investigation, the witnesses or the relatives were extremely upset. And they kept lobbying the president to start an investigation. So finally, after about a year and a half, George Bush appointed the 9/11 Commission. But the people that worked on the commission later said, it's a complete cover-up. Like this is the senior counsel, John Farmer, to the commission. He said, what government and military officials told Congress, the commission, the media, and the public about who knew what when was almost entirely and inexplicably untrue. And these are the two commissioners, co-commissioners, and Thomas Keane said, to this day, we don't know why NORAD told us what they told us. It was just so far from the truth. And NORAD was, of course, the Canadian-American Air Force and how they should respond to the crisis. And they didn't respond in any way that was significant. The planes flew from Otis Air Force Base to Washington, or to New York, with afterburners on full throttle, and they went out over the Atlantic Ocean. What are they doing out there? As I said, as Mr. Mars said, the response was hijacked. Here's the man who wrote the myth. It's Philip Zelikow. And if I remember correctly, he went to Rice University and got his PhD down there. And his specialty, his thesis was, the title of his thesis was On the Creation and Maintenance of the Public Myth. And he wrote 9/11, the myth of 9/11. And you can see in March 2003, he had completed the outline of the 9/11 Commission report before the staff even began working. Then he simply cherry-picked information that would satisfy his agenda. This man was another one. This is Gene Corley. Gene Corley was put in charge of this document to examine what happened to the towers up until the point of collapse. And I called him up because I said, Mr. Corley, are you testing that steel to see if there's any evidence of explosions? And he said, Mr. Bollyn, I don't know anything about that. I'm not a metallurgist. So why was he put in charge of this investigation? Probably for the same reason he was put in charge of the Waco investigation in Oklahoma City. Because he's very good at creating a report that will bolster the official story. Then they did this, NIST did this report. Department of Commerce, sub-agency NIST, they did a report on the collapse. Because the first report only went up to the point of collapse, so this was to cover the collapse. But this report, written by this man here, William Jeffrey, did not even look at the evidence of explosions or molten metal in the dust or in the destruction of the towers. And this man, by the way, Mr. Jeffrey, has a long history of developing advanced weapon systems for the US military and DARPA. Then he went on to become the CEO at Stanford Research, where they develop nanotechnology and energetic materials for the US military. And the guy that runs the laboratory there is Mr. Bloom, an Israeli guy who has been in charge of that laboratory since 1984. And here's Mr. Bloomberg, Mayor Bloomberg, who served 12 years as mayor of New York. That's unprecedented. There was term limits before he came into power, 2 terms. He wound up serving 3 terms. And in that position, he was able to control the testimony and the problems. You have to understand, in New York City, there are thousands and thousands of sick firefighters. There are still 5,700 firefighters who have serious cancer from being exposed to the smoke of 9/11. And 1,600 of the firefighters have already died. So it's a very serious problem. But here he was in 2008, he took a little break from his work in New York and went to visit Ehud Barak, who was busy bombing Gaza at Christmas time 2008. Merry Christmas! Here they go, they weren't dropping just lead, they were dropping white phosphorus on the people of Gaza. This is a war crime. But it's no problem for Mr. Bloomberg or for the Zionist establishment. Oh, that's okay, they covered it up. But this stuff is so hideous. When white phosphorus hits you, it burns all the way through your body, it doesn't stop. Which is why it's banned. Here he is with Mr. Netanyahu. And here they are, he's being shown around by Mr. Bloomberg, showing around the new memorial that was created in New York City. And Mr. Netanyahu wanted to see the names of the 4 Israelis who died that day. There were, of course, you may have heard the report that there were 4,000 Israelis who were thought to have been in the area of the World Trade Center or the Pentagon on 9/11. Then there was some sort of instant messaging service that warned a lot of people not to go there that day, called Odigo. Now, controlling the interpretation. The interpretation of anything like this comes to us through the newspapers and the media. So it's control of the media. And today in this country we have a very serious situation where something like 90% of the media in this country is controlled by 6 corporations. That's a very dangerous consolidation. That means that you're only getting the point of view of those 6 corporations. One of the big ones is this guy, News Corp, Mr. Murdoch. And Mr. Murdoch is an Australian guy who came to this country and bought up newspapers from coast to coast. And he's funded by the Rothschild family, Jacob Rothschild. I want to point out there's some business relation between these guys. I told you that in Iraq, the northern part is Kurdistan. That's where the American troops are, something like 10,000 US troops. They're protecting Kurdistan. Kurdistan is also the place where Mr. Rothschild owns the oil since 2002. And then together, these 2 chaps, along with Dick Cheney and a few others, they own the oil of the Golan Heights, occupied Syria. This is from the New York Times. 3 years after 9/11, on 9/11, they had this very bizarre editorial called "The Public Knowledge of 9/11." This is written by the editors of the New York Times, which is a B'nai B'rith newspaper, owned by the family of Sulzberger Ox. And they said, in the 3 years since 9/11, we've begun to understand that it's possible to know what happened without knowing what happened. That's all. What a bizarre statement. This is the attitude of the American media, that we can understand the emotions of what happened on 9/11, but you don't need to understand anything more than that, because we're not going to tell you. And it says down below, some of what we need to know publicly has been provided by the report of the 9/11 Commission. Other answers are lacking. Like what happened in this building. This 47-story building, WTC-7, fell into its footprint, as Mr. Mars showed you, at 5:23 in the afternoon. Never happened before in the history of the world. But it was not even mentioned in the 9/11 Commission report. It was a non-event. Just like in the current political campaign here in this country, the war in Syria is a non-event. It's a non-event. They don't care. The war on terror, it's okay. It's a wallpaper. You don't like it? Go someplace else. Now, the legacy, this is the interpretation again. The legacy of 9/11 is contained in this memorial in downtown New York, Manhattan. and it's the ground zero. It's the 9/11, memorial. It was built by an Israeli guy. The World Trade Center Memorial was designed by an Israeli, Michael Arad. That's him there, the son of Moshe Arad, the former Israeli ambassador to the United States. So you see, the museum for Americans to go and see and experience Ground Zero is an Israeli experience. And if you don't believe the official account of 9/11, you're in good company. At least 60% of the American people do not believe the official version. Now, the litigation. This is the tort litigation that followed 9/11. There were basically 3,000 American families, or families who lost somebody on 9/11. The first 2,900 took the compensation money, signed the dotted line, and went home, forever to lose their standing in a court of law. But there were 96 families left who didn't want the money. Thank you very much. We want the truth. We want to know what happened on 9/11, and we're going to hold out. And then that became something called the 9/11 tort litigation. And that was managed in his courtroom. This is Alvin K. Hellerstein from Manhattan, U.S. District Judge. And all the tort litigation case came to his courtroom. And he and his team began whittling away at these families, one by one, settling them out of court, one by one, until every single family was settled out of court. So there has been no trial for 9/11, and there never will be a trial for 9/11, because everybody who had standing has been settled out of court. And of course, there's a non-disclosure statement there. You can't talk about it. But there was a fundamental problem here that I discovered, and that the judge who was overseeing the 9/11 litigation, his son is a lawyer in Israel who works for the key defendant. That's the relationship there. That's Joseph Hellerstein, lives on the West Bank settlement. That's his daddy down below. And as you can see, the judge's son is a lawyer with Amit Polak and Matalon in Tel Aviv, who represents the parent company of ICTS, International Consultants on Targeted Security, based in Holland, a Mossad company that oversaw airport security in this country on 9/11. And they owned a little company called Huntley USA, which oversaw all passenger screening. That's why they were in the 9/11 litigation, because the people wanted to know, how did these 19 guys get on the plane with box cutters, etc., etc.? That company would have had to provide the videotape and the information about who got on the plane that day and who didn't get on the plane that day. And they didn't want to divulge that, probably because those 19 guys weren't even on the planes. So the judge excused ICTS from the court process. He said, in his single unilateral release of the company, he said, "You're just the parent company of ICTS, or you're the parent company of Huntley. I don't see why you're here. You can go home." So they whittled down the case until there was nothing left to the litigation to be gained. So the final families just caved and said, "Forget about it. We're not going to get any truth in this process anyway. Better just take the money." And that was the end of it. Most peculiar, 3,000 people killed in broad daylight in New York City, and not a single day in court. So this is how the payout went. Kenneth Feinberg at the top, very high-level Zionist fella. He oversaw the doling out. He's always a special master. Whenever there's a big fund to be doling out money to the citizens, he's always made the special master. And he and his wife were in charge of dishing out the money to the first 2,900. Then the remaining 96 families were dealt with by Sheila Birnbaum down below. She's a lawyer, a big lawyer for a group called Skadden Arps, a law firm with very close ties to Israel. And this is Judge McCasey, Michael McCasey. He became Attorney General in 2007 for a while. He's also played a key role in the whole thing, because in 1993 he oversaw the court process for the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. If you remember, in 1993 there was a bomb in the basement, killed 8 people, and that was meant to impress on the American public that Arabs are trying to break down the World Trade Center, so that when it did happen, years later, 7 years later, the American public automatically thought, "Oh yeah, it's the Arabs. They finally succeeded in doing it." That's called ideation. They put the idea out there. They make films. They made a film about the 1993 bombing. That was the blind cleric and all those guys. They made a film. And at the end of the film, one of the Arab bad guys is in the back of a car, and he drives by the World Trade Center and he says, "Next time we'll bring them both down." And that's what the American public watches on Hollywood TV. So they think, yeah, the World Trade Center got attacked. Who else? Osama bin Laden and the Arabs, right? Who else? He also oversaw the litigation by Larry Silverstein, in which he received something like $7.2 billion based on his $100 million of down payment. He's got double indemnity. Over $7 billion he got. So what are they covering up? The government media are suppressing 9/11 evidence that would expose the official myth as a pack of lies, to prevent the real culprits from being identified, which is what my book does. My book, Solving 9/11, The Deception Changed the World, and the big book, I have both books back there, the original articles. That was my research. I saw that the media and the government were not going to investigate 9/11. I saw there were coming up very important aspects of it, and I realized they're not going to solve it. That makes it incumbent on us as independent journalists to solve it. That's why I dedicated 12 years of my life, 15 years of my life doing this. I went to Germany after 9/11 and met some big intelligence chiefs over there. In the first couple of days I was there, and one of them told me that 9/11 looked like a Hollywood production. Then this other guy, Vertebach, told me that the deathly precision and magnitude of planning behind the attacks would have needed years of planning and the fixed frame of a state intelligence organization. Bingo. So what state are we talking about? Saudi Arabia? I don't think so. Here's Andreas von Bülow. I met him too. I asked him, who do you think was behind it? He said, right away, he said Mossad. I printed that in my little newspaper in Washington. I wrote that Mr. von Bülow said that. And he was surprised. He said, he tells that to every German journalist, but it was never reported in a German newspaper. Because it's forbidden in Germany to point a finger at the Jews or Israel. It's forbidden. You'll go to jail. But my little newspaper printed it. What he said is that there are 3 levels to such a cover-up, 3 levels to such an operation. There's the architectural level, the managerial level, and the working level. And at the top level, the architectural level, he said, is they plan a crime like this in order to affect the public opinion. So 9/11 was carried out in order to change American public opinion, to make us ready to go to war in the Middle East. That was the name of the game. Then the managerial level, they managed the crime and they managed the cover-up. And the working level, he said, is part of the deception. That's like the 19 Arabs. These guys here, these are the 19 alleged hijackers of 9/11. And as Mr. Mars said, many of them had duplicate license, duplicate issued IDs. At least 6 of them had duplicate Florida licenses, and many had reported lost passports. There you understand, it's duplicate documents like that are used to create false histories. The way that it worked in Florida is that one of these guys would go on Tuesday to get a license, and he'd get the license on Tuesday, and the very next day he or somebody using his name would call up and say, I just moved to a new apartment and I have a new address. Can you issue me a new license with my new address? And they would do that in Florida. And they would mail a new license to him at his new address. So you had one person here with a Muhammad Atta passport or license, and one person over here. So you had a lookalike who was using the same ID and leaving a false trail. Now that's a little complicated. Americans don't usually operate like that. If you want to understand how that works, you've got to read this book by John Le Carre. It's called The Little Drummer Girl. And it was written in 1982 with the help of Israeli military intelligence. He names the people in the beginning of the book who helped him write the book. And in this book, they made a movie out of it by Diane Keaton. But in the book, the head Mossadnik guy tells the English actress who was helping them, he said, terror is theater. Theater is a contrick. Do you know what that means? Contrick, you've been deceived. So they lay a false trail for a guy, then they do a crime, and then that person who they laid the trail for is found dead. Oh yeah, he did it. It all makes sense. See the evidence? This is just like the vodka drinking Arabs of South Florida. It's a false trail. Here's another guy. This is Brian Jenkins from Chicago. He's with the RAND Corporation. In 1974, he said, terrorism is aimed at the people watching, not at the actual victims. Terrorism is theater. I remind you, I would urge you to keep that in mind. Terrorism is theater. Next time you open the TV and you see something terrible has happened someplace, this is theater. It's meant to affect your public, it's meant to affect how you think about something. And he went on to say in his paper, the normal objective of state or official terrorism is to enforce obedience and cooperation. That's where we are today, obedience and cooperation. Obedience at the airport and cooperation in the war on terror. Now some of the anomalies. Here's the plane that flew into the South Tower. This is supposedly Flight 175, United Airlines. But what color are the bottom of United Airlines planes? Dark blue, very dark blue. This one is gray, and this one has a groove down the middle, which is indicative of a 767 tanker aircraft. And as you can see, there's some weaponization going on the bottom of that plane too. There is something under the fuselage by the right wing that is not belonging to usually to a normal passenger plane. And when the plane went into the building, it emitted a missile-like object that was burning white hot that pierced into the building just before the plane struck. So the plane was going very fast, and then it fired a missile, and that missile created a very hot white hole in the side of the building. which obviously facilitated the entry of the fuselage into the building. It's a white hot hole, like open sesame. But now when I look at this, I've done a lot of research on something called depleted uranium, DU warheads. It's the silver bullet in the American arsenal right now because it busts through anything. It's armor piercing, but it's uranium. It's very dense, very hot, pyrophoric. It burns in the air. So I said, well, if that looks like DU, if that was a DU missile, then it must have gone out the other side. It must have, because it's so dense. And lo and behold, there it goes. You see it coming out behind the pole over there? Coming out with great momentum, we see a burning hot white object. Here's another picture of it seen against the dark blue sky, the clear blue sky. You can see it's burning white hot and leaving behind a trail of dark oxides. That's not part of the aircraft. And here it is, there's two pieces that actually came out. If you look at the videos, you can see for yourselves. If you look at the videos of Flight 175 striking the building. One part is burning white hot and leaving a trail of oxides, but those oxides are so hot that it takes a little bit of time before they become visible. And the other part is like an engine or something, part of the missile. And I contacted my friend my mentor at Lawrence Livermore Lab. His name's Marion Falk. Marion Falk is an older guy, and he had worked on everything that they had done at Livermore from the Manhattan Project. He'd worked on the Manhattan Project all the way through Star Wars. And he used me like as a vessel to explain to the American people the dangers of radiation because he felt he owed it to the American people. And he often said to me, his motto is, there's no safe dosage of radiation. Remember that when you go to the airport next time. And choose the pat down. There's no safe dosage of radiation. And so I asked him, Marion, I said, does this burning object, does this have the characteristics of a burning DU warhead? And he said, yes, it does. So here's the explosion that came out of the entry wound where the plane went in. And as you can see, that the initial explosion was surrounded by white smoke. White smoke is indicative of thermite. When thermite reacts, it creates a white smoke, extremely hot temperatures, and then molten iron, or molten whatever the metal is. So you can see here that these initial explosions were marked with white smoke, which suggests to me that there were large amounts of thermite packed on that floor where the plane went in, or where the missile went in. Now here we see the same thing, North Tower, same thing, big explosion, white smoke shooting out of the side of the room. Now both planes went into secure computer rooms. That was a discovery I made actually. This plane, North Tower, it went into secure computer room of a group called Marsh McLennan Corporate Company, which is owned by Maurice Greenberg's son and Maurice Greenberg. And the second tower, it went into the computer floor of Fujibank. And these are floors that have super reinforced elevated floors and just rows and rows and rows of very large computer server units and other things. No people though. And here we see a thermetic reaction occurring about 7 minutes before the South Tower fell. This is the east corner of South Tower, building number 2. And you see there from the 81st floor, something's broken, the floor is buckled, and we see a thermetic reaction occurring. Again, you see the white smoke. You see the white smoke that's indicative of thermite. Now, a reaction like this creates extremely hot temperature, and it creates molten metal. Exactly 1 minute later, we saw a cascade of molten iron begin to fall. This fell for 7 minutes until the building collapsed. And the question is, when I understood all this, I said, how did they put 1 cubic meter of molten iron, weighs 6.6 tons? How did they get that much thermite or molten iron up there that became molten iron? How did they get it into that room? And I found out it was owned by Fujibank, that it was a computer floor. And a guy who worked for that computer floor contacted me and he said, you know, the strange thing was, he said that in the summer before 9/11, at night, they would deliver these big black boxes. He said they were huge black boxes. And we were told, he said, that these were backup batteries for the computer system. But he said the weird thing was, they were never plugged in. They weren't plugged in because they weren't batteries. They were large, heavy boxes of thermite. And then, of course, the towers were pulverized. And these large clouds of dust contained huge amounts, billions and billions of tiny droplets of iron, which is produced when nanothermite goes off. So this is what we see. This is from the U.S. Geological Survey of the dust. When I first obtained these pictures was in 2006. This is when I got in a lot of trouble. 2006 in California. And I had been meeting Professor Jones out in Utah, and I went out to Davis, California, and I wanted to get the U.S. Geological Survey of the 9/11 dust. There were only 2 copies in the entire state of California. One at UC Davis Science Library, one at UC Irvine. And I was lucky, I was able to find it. I got the Science Library. I photocopied the whole damn document and took it back with me to Utah and showed it to Professor Jones. And it showed these photographs, it showed these micrographs showing that the signature characteristic of the dust was all these little tiny balls, like little tennis balls. And up close you can see they're little tiny droplets of iron. They're microscopic. So billions of tiny balls of molten iron were formed at extremely high temperatures during the demolition of the towers. Burning jet fuel or office fires cannot possibly produce such molten iron, but thermite can. This is why the government reports have ignored this evidence from the crime scene. And then there was this little critter. This was found, this is through an FOIA request. They found that actually the dust also contained tiny droplets of molybdenum. Now this is very problematic because molybdenum has the 4th highest melting temperature on the periodic table. This tells you it melts at 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Now this tells you that the destruction of the World Trade Center was extremely hot. Now these discoveries were made early. The discovery of nanothermite in the dust was made in 2009. The next year, Judy Wood came out with a book that said that the destruction of the World Trade Center was a cold event, she said. It was done using some sort of special Buck Rogers type beam weapon that disassociated the molecules, but was cold. No, the destruction of the World Trade Center was extremely, extremely hot. It was so hot that I call it an American Holocaust, because the 2,700 people who died on 9/11 in the World Trade Center were cooked to death before they were blown up. It was so hot, you can imagine, if on the 82nd floor you have a pool of molten iron, the people on the 83rd and 84th floor are getting cooked. And that's why the one lady said, she called 9/11, she said, "We're all gonna die." The 9/11 lady, the dispatcher said, "No ma'am, help's on the way, don't worry, you'll be all right." The lady on the phone said, "No, you don't understand, it's very, very hot here." Which is why all the people crowded to the windows, the open holes in the building, and jumped to their deaths. Sometimes they held hands, 2, 3, 4, and jumped. Because it was so hot that they said, either I stay here and get cooked like a chicken, or I jump to my death. And the New York firefighters down below, they said, you had to imagine how bad it was up there, that the better option was to jump. At least 250 people jumped. 250. Now here shows you the potential of thermites. These are just normal everyday thermites. This is US DOD document, energetic center. And the very top bar there, the very top one is aluminum and molybdenum trioxide. Now that's exactly the kind of thermetic reaction that would produce molten molybdenum. And it shows you here that these thermites have higher energy density per gram than explosives, than high explosives. The bottom 4 things are explosives, the top 4 things are thermite. And there's the third point, the third bullet point there says, potential exists to increase kinetics by size reduction. That's a little scientific, but what it means is if you reduce the size of the reactant particles, the aluminum and the oxide, you're going to get, using nanotechnology, you're going to get a whole nother explosion. You're going to get something that's extremely powerful and is supersonic. Oh, that wasn't supposed to go that fast. There. This is, I think you might have seen this slide Mr. Mars showed you, but there was these box columns, he said, these 47 box columns that held up the building. They held up the gravity load of the towers. And all 47 box columns had to be cut. And obviously this one that's behind the middle firefighter has been cut with a sort of cutter charge, a thermite cutter charge that melts. It goes through steel like a warm knife through butter. This is what they found in the dust of World Trade Center. They thought it was paint, but when they heated these little chips up to 430 degrees Celsius, they went off with a bang and produced a little tiny droplet of iron and a little puff of white smoke. An incredible, incredible heat. This is what it looks like up close. It's called nanothermite. It looks to me like this may have been a foil, a foil with red on one side and silver on the other side. But in any case, the red layer is the thermetic layer. And this is used nanotechnology. You're basically aligning the reactants side by side so that they fit molecule by molecule against each other. That means you're increasing the surface area of the reaction immensely. So you're creating a whole other product. And then into that matrix, they inserted an organic compound which produces the gas. So you have the reaction, supersonic, and the gas, super explosion. They put so much of this thermetic stuff in the World Trade Center that for 3 months there was an extremely hot fire burning beneath the rubble. But it wasn't a fire. It was a chemical reaction. And the New York Fire Department was spraying 24/7 water on the pile. But the fire never went out because it wasn't a fire. It did not require oxygen. It had its own oxygen down there. And so what I found is that this is where I got in trouble. We knew that thermite was involved, and the smoke is a very important aspect of the discovery I made. A man from University of California, Davis, where I started my education. This man, he was with the aerosol. They have a special aerosol group, which basically usually measures pollution on the side of the road, whatnot, on the highways in California. But he had a colleague out in New York who said, "Send us one of those Davis drums." And he sent the Davis drum to New York, and they put it up on top of a building on Varick Street, just north of this area here. So when the wind blew the smoke through that drum, the drum would analyze the particles, the aerosol particles. And what they found is that this thin blue smoke contained huge amounts of nanoparticles. Again, nano means something very, very tiny, tiny, tiny. It's smaller than 1/10 of a micron in diameter. Now that's important. Like Marion Folk told me, that produces something called the particle effect. What that means to your human health is that if you inhale this smoke, which is laden with nanoparticles, those nanoparticles will not stop in your nose, your throat, or even your lungs, or even in the tiny capillaries of your lungs. They will pass through, they're so small, they will pass through every membrane in the human body until they get to the nucleus of the human cell. And there they will lodge themselves and start firing off their particles and creating cancers and Parkinson's disease and all these very, very terrible diseases. And I asked Professor Cahill and Davis, I said, "Professor Cahill, can you explain to me what would produce nanoparticles in the smoke?" And he said, "Only temperatures hotter than the boiling point of the metal involved." So I wrote an article, "Why did iron boil beneath the rubble of the World Trade Center?" I wrote it for my little newspaper called American Free Press. It was a great article. It was the nail in the coffin on the official version of what happened on 9/11. The next day, the editor in Washington called me up. I was still in Davis, California. He said, "Christopher, we've decided to reduce your travel allowance to 0, which meant that I had to leave my safe homes in California and Colorado, and I had to go back to Chicago, where Homeland Security was waiting for me with a little tactical unit of the Hoffman State Police, and they attacked me and criminalized me." But that's another story. So these are the firefighters who were exposed to that smoke. And you'll see these guys did not have any protection at all. But I should tell you, there is no protection from nanoparticles because they're so small, there's no respirator that can stop them. So even if these guys had the state-of-the-art respirators, they would actually have to have their own oxygen and be breathing their own oxygen to be exposed to the smoke and survive. So 1,600 of these firefighters have died of cancer. Young men. And there are still 5,700 who are dying of cancer in New York alone. So you can see. And the EPA told us the air was safe to breathe. What a big whopping lie that was. When Thomas Cahill from UC Delta Institute went out to New York to see how the drum was doing, he was met at the airport by the EPA, and they said, "Who asked you to do this, and who's paying for it?" That's all they wanted to know. And he said he assumed that the federal government would be monitoring the air quality in New York, and he was shocked that they weren't doing anything. Rather, Christy Todd Whitman said, the air is safe to breathe. That's a big lie that has taken the lives of thousands of New Yorkers to this day. Where's the criminal action against her? And then they removed the rubble and they found that beneath it was molten iron, right under the rubble. It was plain as day. The firefighters said, you get down below and you see molten steel running down the channel rails like in a foundry, like lava, like a volcano. And in 2002, I called up Peter Tully. He's the only American guy who was involved in the removal of the rubble. And he told me that he found molten steel in the molten state 5 weeks later when they got down to the bedrock of Manhattan, because there were 7 basement levels. So when they got all the way down to the bedrock of Manhattan, he said they found this, and I thought, that's really incredible. And then I contacted another guy who was involved in the cleanup. His name was Mark Loiseau from Controlled Demolition in Maryland. And I asked him, you know, Mark, I heard from Mr. Tully that they found molten steel in the molten state. And he said, yes, at the bottoms of 1, 2, and 7. And I said, can you explain what would create molten steel or molten iron at the bedrock of Manhattan? And he said, well, think of all the paper that fell down those elevator shafts. So, I mean, it's pretty obvious, like, you know, the cover-up is pretty obvious. It's in your face, especially if you're a journalist like me asking questions. You get strange answers. And here's another thing. This is building 6. Mr. Mars said building 5. This is actually building 6 we're talking about here. And this is the building between 1 and 7. And it's also known as the U.S. Customs House. And as Mr. Mars said, something very strange happened here at about 9:03 in the morning at the same time South Tower got hit. Something very strange happened here, a tremendous explosion. And as you can see, after one of the towers collapsed, you can see the building is in terrible shape. That previous slide showed you before any collapse. So we know that this building was toast before either building had fallen. The slide Mr. Mars said also showed that. And here we see the building 6 in the lower left-hand corner, and you see that tremendous hole, that crater. Now, what was in the basement of building 6, the U.S. Customs House? That was the evidence vault. That's where all the evidence from all the big crimes in the 1990s was being investigated, were the prosecutions that were based in building 7 and building 6. Building 7 and building 6 were all federal agencies, IRS, Secret Service, Treasury, etc. And the crimes that they were investigating in New York, all the evidence was in that vault, along with some gold. Building 7 is gone, Building 1 is gone, Building 2 is gone, and then you see the remains of 4, 5, and 6. 6 is over here, and that's the World Trade Center. Now, when I saw that, this picture shows that the actual crater goes down into the basement. There's one thing you have to understand about this basement. Besides being the vault, we now know from the videographer named Kurt Sonnenfeld, who went down there and photographed it, that the vault door had been busted open, and that the doors were wide open, and the vault had been cleaned out the night before. So that indicates that the bad guys, the rats, went in there, took off all the loot, and then blew the place up the next morning. Like I said, it's a crime within a crime within a crime. And here's the Pentagon. You've heard all about that. The plane supposedly came across the lawn and did all this without leaving any part of itself on the lawn, without taking out those cable spools, without leaving a hole. Highly unlikely. And we're told that the plane came through like this and made the hole down there in the bottom on the inside ring. But one thing you have to understand, first of all, is that the outside wall of the Pentagon was 1 meter thick, 1 yard thick, reinforced concrete and masonry. A plane's not going to go through a meter thick wall very easily and have the energy to go all the way through and leave a hole in the wall, all at the same time doing the trick of not taking out the columns between. So we're dealing with something like a missile. Some sort of missile head went through there and you know, went through the columns. It was not so big, but it took out the terrible hole on the inside. The investigation of the Pentagon that was done by the engineers were locked out of this section of the Pentagon. The FBI had put up those chipboard wall boards and said, FBI only, no engineers please. And the guys that went into the into the Pentagon were protected for respiration, and they knew they were going into a toxic environment. They were decontaminated afterwards. And this is the final slide. This is the hole in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, actually in a mine. It's a reclaimed mine. And we're told that a large Boeing aircraft went into this hole, leaving behind only a little smoking hole 20 feet across. What happened here actually was that my analysis indicates that the A-10 Warthog that disappeared over the trees fired a ground-to-air missile into the pre-existing trench in this mine and made it look like a plane went into the hole here. But the county coroner, Wally Miller, went up to the hole and he said, after 20 minutes I stopped being the coroner because there were no bodies. The mayor of Shanksville, Ernie Stahl, went up there and he said, he told German media, there was no part of an aircraft here. No aircraft went into this hole. So I went to this place. I spoke to the Somerset Tribune, the local paper in Shanksville, and I said, I'd like to talk to you about how you've covered this whole story. It's your local story here. It's a little, very rural part of Pennsylvania. And he said, the editor said, sure, come on in on 3 o'clock on Wednesday afternoon. So I came in on Wednesday, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and he took me into a back room and sat me down with a U.S. military intelligence officer named Labor-Knight. And I said, why am I talking to you, Mr. Labor-Knight? And he said, I've been seconded to the paper to answer your questions. I said, okay, can you tell me first of all, how can we find no parts of an aircraft in this hole? And he said, well, it's very simple. He said, the plane came very fast and the ground was very soft. And the ground, when the plane hit the ground, the ground liquefied and swallowed the plane. Oh, but he said one wing bounced. One wing bounced a half mile in the woods. What's he talking about? Well, he's talking about the fact that the actual debris field was about a half mile in the woods to the left here. And that's where they were actually picking up the body parts. So we were given like an old stage magician trick. Look here, not there. Over here you have the hole in the ground, that's where the plane went, when actually over here in the woods they're picking up the body parts and whatever else they picked up on the plane. And you should know that the body parts that they picked up in Shanksville were then sent to Dover Air Force Base, where they were identified in Dover, Delaware, where they were again handled by FBI agents, and any body part they could not identify, they simply cremated and put in the landfill. They've been doing that, the mortuary in Denver, in Dover's been doing that for over 10 years. It's terrible. So the question is, people always want to know, what can we do? And I say, the war on terror is meant to cause distress, confusion, and fear as it enslaves us to an open-ended criminal war agenda. To accept it without resisting is not rational. To do nothing is not a sensible option. This is what you can do. Inform yourselves, act upon, organize yourselves, and act upon what you know. And this is what, like what Ron has done here. He's informed. You can read my book. You can understand the war on deception is a hoax, and 9/11 is a hoax. And it's been done to enslave us. So then you organize other people, and you do things like this. This is a great event that Ron's pulled together here. And why? Why do we have to do that? Well, obviously for the future generations. This is a little supporter of mine out in Montana. And what kind of peace, these are the words of Kennedy. What kind of peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana enforced on the world by American weapons of war. Not a peace of the grave or the security of the slave. I'm talking about genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, the kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and to build a better life for their children. Not merely peace in our time, but peace for all time. So thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure.